I've got something to say to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer. A lot of people are talking, they're saying he's spending more time talking about the world than fixing his own country. And I've seen it, total disaster over there. The economy, not good. Borders, wide open. Energy, windmills everywhere, doing nothing. And yet he's out there making speeches about the world's problems. Let me tell you something, Starmer. Worry about your country first, because
there's been chaos erupting in the United Kingdom with riots over immigration, far-right and immigrant protesters clashing in the streets, quite literally. Let's go ahead and put some of the video our team assembled here. This is just some examples of what's been happening.
It's hard not to think the UK is on fire. There's anger everywhere. Is it?
People are extremely angry.
A dangerous level of anger, in your view?
Yeah, seething with anger.
The world woke up to a headline no one ever imagined. Africa declares the UK a global security risk. In an instant, everything flipped. A nation that once dictated global stability has become the center of chaos and collapsing control. And while Britain scrambles to patch holes in its security system, Africa is doing something unprecedented publicly, calling out the UK's failures with evidence so undeniable that even Europe...
It took me going through a traumatic experience to realise that the UK is finished. Whatever you do, get out of here. I don't know what our money is going towards. I don't know what we're paying for, because guess what? I had to book an appointment to get them to take a statement from me tomorrow. But when I told the police, oh, just go to that area, that's where he's lurking. Oh, we can't just pull him off the streets. So why do you not do stops and searches if you can't just be pulling people off the streets? Is it just a pick and choosing?
For decades, Britain portrayed itself as the standard, the model, the benchmark. But now it is Africa exposing the cracks, Africa revealing the weakness, Africa showing the world that the once mighty UK has lost the very thing it preached about for generations: control. This is not diplomacy. This is not politics. This is a seismic shift in global power where Africa rises with unity and precision, while the UK spirals into a crisis it can no longer hide. And the most shocking part, Africa isn't done talking. Africa is just getting started.
London used to be one of the safest cities in the world, but under Conservative and Labour, it is becoming increasingly unsafe. I'm right here in Oxford Street, the best location if you're a phone thief. In fact, more than half the crimes committed in Westminster are thefts, and Oxford Street is a hotspot. And take it from me, there is not one policeman in sight. Only reform will put visible policing back on the streets and end the lawlessness.
The crisis did not begin with an explosion or a cyber attack. It began with a report, a simple, confidential assessment from Africa's Joint Security Council that leaked across global media within minutes. The report stated bluntly and without diplomatic cushioning that the United Kingdom had lost structural control over key areas of national security. Within hours, headlines across the world erupted. London was in shock. Africa was unapologetic. And Britain's long-held image as a stable global power was suddenly under the harshest spotlight it had faced in decades. The assessment came from an unexpected source. Africa had spent years strengthening its regional intelligence networks, developing technology, and building surveillance infrastructure not dependent on foreign control. What began as a continental effort to secure borders and combat piracy evolved into one of the world's most advanced cooperative security systems. When Africa released its findings, it wasn't out of hostility, it was out of frustration. Britain had been ignoring warnings for years. Africa's report highlighted vulnerabilities in policing, border control, cyber systems, and even national infrastructure. Energy grids overstretched, emergency services underfunded, ports operating with outdated technology, airports with blind surveillance zones, a rise in organized crime groups exploiting gaps the government failed to close. The message from Africa was clear: Britain no longer commanded the security authority it once projected globally. Inside the UK, the reaction was chaotic. Parliament scrambled into emergency hearings. Security officials faced relentless questioning, unable to explain how an entire continent saw the cracks before they did. Citizens demanded answers. Some dismissed Africa's report as political posturing, but the evidence told another story, and the consequences were growing impossible to ignore. Africa's bold statement didn't appear out of thin air. For years, African nations had watched how Britain responded to the continent's rise with skepticism, outdated assumptions, and a constant belief that Africa remained dependent on Western guidance. But times had changed. African nations had invested heavily in cybersecurity, maritime defense, intelligence sharing, and border management. They built systems designed for the future, not relics of a colonial past. Meanwhile, the UK struggled under budget cuts, political instability, and aging infrastructure. The turning point came when a major African shipping alliance reported repeated security failures at British ports. Containers vanished, cargo was delayed, tracking systems failed. When Britain dismissed the complaints, Africa launched its own investigation and uncovered much more than shipping inefficiency. It discovered deeper cracks in policing coordination, data handling, and logistical oversight. Those findings formed the backbone of the report that would soon shake the world. Britain tried to minimize the damage. Officials released statements claiming the report was exaggerated, but no amount of denial could undo the fact that Africa's assessment was backed by data, surveillance logs, and independent verification. The global community took notice. Investors watched nervously. Insurance firms began re-evaluating risk categories for UK transport infrastructure. Airlines demanded audits. Shipping corporations questioned whether British ports were still reliable transit points for global trade. Africa, meanwhile, was unbothered by Britain's outrage. The continent had grown tired of being treated as an inferior. Voice in global security matters. African nations had saved shipping lanes from piracy, developed some of the world's fastest-growing cybersecurity hubs, and deployed new border technologies that surpassed those used in Europe. The continent felt not only justified but obligated to call out Britain's failures, especially when those failures affected African trade. African citizens and African assets operating in UK territory. In London, the political cracks widened. Opposition parties accused the government of negligence. Former officials warned that Britain had been ignoring structural weaknesses for a decade. Tech analysts revealed that many security systems relied on outdated software no longer supported by manufacturers. Reports surfaced that budget cuts had forced multiple agencies to rely on manual processes instead of automated ones. The more Britain tried to deny the crisis, the more the truth spilled out. What made the situation worse was the timing. Africa was rising confidently economically, technologically, and diplomatically, while the UK faced internal economic strain, energy shortages, and political instability. Suddenly, global perception flipped. Africa appeared organized, modern, and strategically alert. Britain appeared defensive, overwhelmed, and unable to maintain the image of a stable power. African citizens celebrated the shift, viewing it as a long overdue reversal of roles. The United States and European nations approached the crisis cautiously. They issued statements acknowledging Britain's concerns, but subtly noted Africa's growing security sophistication. Some even hinted that African evaluations were now as credible as Western intelligence reports, a statement that would have been unthinkable 2 decades earlier. International media amplified Africa's voice, noting that the continent had become a critical contributor to global security stability. As the shock settled, Britain closed its doors for high-level emergency meetings. Officials debated launching a counter-report to discredit Africa's findings, but data analysts warned that such a move could backfire. The evidence against the UK was too strong. Some urged cooperation with Africa to restore Britain's credibility. Others refused to consider working under African oversight, fearing political humiliation. But Africa wasn't seeking domination or revenge. It wanted accountability. It wanted respect. It wanted Britain to recognize that the world had changed and that Africa was no longer a passive observer of global power, but a key architect shaping its future. The crisis deepened when African business councils announced they were re-evaluating British investment deals due to security concerns. Markets reacted instantly. The UK's currency dipped. Stock prices of major security contractors fell. International shipping companies threatened to reroute cargo away from British ports until confidence was restored. The government couldn't deny the crisis anymore. Africa's declaration had financial teeth. As African leaders held press conferences, they spoke calmly, professionally, and with authority. They emphasized that the report was not meant to embarrass Britain, but to warn it, because Britain's security failure didn't just endanger Britain, it endangered everyone connected to British trade, technology, and transit routes. The continent insisted it had a responsibility to voice the concerns others refused to address. And for the first time in decades, the UK had to listen, because Africa wasn't just speaking loudly. Africa was speaking from a position of undeniable power. The warnings had been ignored for too long, and now the consequences were undeniable. As the security crisis in the UK deepened, African nations that had once been dismissed as junior partners began to evaluate the unfolding chaos with cold, strategic clarity. What they saw was not merely a country struggling with internal instability, but a nation fundamentally unable to protect its own citizens, manage its own borders, or maintain the global influence it had relied on for centuries. African governments watched closely as the UK scrambled to contain a surge of organized crime networks, cyber attacks, widespread staffing shortages in law enforcement, and rising distrust between communities. None of this occurred overnight. It had been building like pressure beneath a cracking wall, but few in Britain had been willing to admit the scale of the decay. Now the cracks were flooding open. The UK had spent decades lecturing Africa about stability, good governance, and security reforms, always speaking from a position of assumed superiority. Yet at this moment, African countries were demonstrating greater regional coordination, stronger intelligence networks, more effective counter-terror systems, and far more advanced digital monitoring capabilities than the UK itself. While Britain was struggling to recruit police officers and losing cybersecurity analysts to other countries, African states were hosting new data centers, advanced surveillance training facilities, and specialized task forces that had quickly gained global respect. And so, African leaders felt no hesitation in making their assessment. Public, the UK had lost control. It was not an insult, but a blunt analysis, one that many other nations whispered behind closed doors but refused to say openly. Africa, however, no longer saw any benefit in softening its words for Western comfort. The shift began when African security agencies released a joint report outlining the extent of Britain's internal vulnerabilities. This report shocked the world. It detailed how UK intelligence sharing had become unreliable, how many of Britain's critical systems were unprotected, and how the country was losing its grip on organized crime faster than anyone had realized. Some sectors in Europe were outraged that Africa had dared to publish such a thing, but the evidence presented was too overwhelming to refute. Once that information became public, international corporations began reconsidering their contracts with UK partners. Investors who previously saw Britain as a safe haven suddenly viewed it with caution. Insurance companies increased their rates, logistics firms rerouted shipments away from the country, and global security alliances quietly shifted their internal weighting, placing Africa as a rising hub of reliability while Britain slipped lower. Meanwhile, the African Union initiated a new continental security framework, one designed to match the scale and complexity of modern threats. It integrated everything from maritime patrol systems to drone-based monitoring, from cross-border criminal databases to advanced ransomware defenses. Unlike the fragmented systems in the UK, Africa's approach was decentralized but coordinated, adaptable yet consistent. It was the very model Western countries once pushed Africa to adopt, yet now Africa was outperforming those very nations. As the crisis inside Britain intensified, political figures attempted to reassure the public that the situation was under control. But leaked intelligence reports showed otherwise. Large areas of the country were struggling with record staffing shortages in emergency services. Authorities were stretched thin, technology systems were outdated, and communities were demanding answers the government simply could not provide. Africa, observing all of this, decided it could no longer pretend that Britain remained a dependable partner in security matters. Some African countries suspended joint training programs with UK agencies, stating that their own systems were now more advanced. Others halted intelligence collaboration, citing concerns that sensitive information could be exposed through compromised UK networks. The reaction in London was defensive, even desperate. British leaders accused African nations of exaggerating the situation or using it to gain geopolitical leverage. But the international community didn't buy these claims. The world had watched Africa modernize its security architecture while Britain clung to outdated structures created decades earlier. And now that Africa was calling out the UK's failures plainly, the UK could no longer hide them. The situation reached a breaking point when African maritime authorities announced that ships traveling through their jurisdiction would no longer rely on UK-issued security certifications, calling them insufficient. This was a humiliation for Britain, whose maritime standards had once been trusted worldwide. But Africa had the data. To prove its point, African ports were now among the fastest modernizing and most secure globally, while UK ports struggled with cyber vulnerabilities and trafficking incidents that had quadrupled in just a few years. African citizens, for the first time, saw their governments on the global stage asserting themselves with confidence and precision. They watched news channels showing African analysts dismantling UK security policies with ease. They saw European officials scrambling to defend the UK while quietly asking African nations for advice. They saw global businesses shifting their attention from London to African capitals. It was a reversal no one had predicted a decade earlier. Back in the UK, ordinary residents expressed frustration. They questioned how their country, once one of the strongest global powers, had reached a point where Africa was now the one pointing out its failures, but this frustration quickly turned into denial. Many Brits refused to accept that Africa had surpassed them in anything, especially security. They blamed their own politicians or global trends or the media, but never acknowledged that their former colonies had become more advanced than them. Meanwhile, Africa continued building. New security academies were established, new satellite surveillance programs activated, new cross-border communication systems tested. The continent was moving forward with relentless momentum, and each step forward made Britain's stagnation more obvious. International observers began to phrase it bluntly. Africa had grown, evolved, innovated, while Britain had grown complacent. The UK had underestimated how quickly the world was changing and overestimated its own ability to keep up. Africa had spent decades being dismissed, underestimated, and undervalued, but the continent used that period to rebuild and restructure, and now, as the UK struggled to keep itself together, Africa was rising with a confidence the world could no longer deny. In this new global landscape, Britain no longer held the authority it once did. African nations were not seeking revenge, nor vindication. They were simply stating the truth. A truth the world needed to hear, a truth Britain could no longer escape. Africa was no longer carrying Britain. Africa was no longer adjusting itself to make Britain comfortable. Africa was no longer pretending that the UK remained stable or reliable. The continent had stepped into a new era, and the UK had stepped into a crisis it could no longer control, and the world was watching.